In this video, we'll take a look at the Vintage Signature Series Photoshop actions from Photography.Planet. This is one of our more flexible sets of Photoshop actions. It works by combining stackable effects to allow you to create a customized vintage effect for your photos. If you've used vintage actions in the past, you've probably had situations where a particular vintage style action looks great on one photo, but when you try to use it on another photo, it just doesn't look the same, and can be very frustrating trying to get the effect that you want with one-click vintage Photoshop actions. This set allows you to start with a base effect and then make other adjustments to it and tweaks, which allows you to create the effect that looks best with a specific photo rather than a one-size-fits-all solution. So I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate how the actions work with a sample photo. First, the actions, as I mentioned, they're stackable. They have several different types of actions included in this set. There are the base actions, and this set includes 20 different bases. They can be used as one-click effects, just like regular typical Photoshop actions, or they can be used as a foundation, and you can then use the other actions in the set, such as the adjustment actions and tone actions, to really customize the look and get it to work just right with your photo. And there are also light leaks that help to get that vintage feel. And then there are actions for adding grain, vignettes, and then we have a few finishing actions as well. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the base actions. There is a run all action for the bases that when you play that, it will apply all 20 of the base effects. You don't have to use this. If you know that you want to use a specific action, you can just go and run that particular base action. But if you're starting from scratch and just experimenting to see what works best with a particular photo, it's really helpful to run all the base effects, and then you can compare them and see what works best. So now that it's run over here in the layers palette, you'll see that there are 20 different folders, one for each of the base effects, and you can show and hide them to see which one works best with your photo. So I'm going to go through them quickly. There is vintage film, which is just kind of a standard simple vintage effect. Cross-processed film, vintage fade, vintage love, retro fun, twisted vintage, dreamy vintage, throwback, breezy, purplish, redness, frost, washed vintage, saturated vintage, bluish tint, vintage color, bliss, blessed, and warm vintage. So by running them all, you can easily see how each action will impact the photo and determine which one you want to use. In this case, I think I'm going to work with the washed vintage base, and then we will go from there and work with some of the other actions in the set. So now we'll move on to the adjustments. And there's also a run all action for the adjustments, which I'm going to use. Again, you don't have to run them all. If you know that you just want to run a particular action, you can do that. But if you're working with a new photo and experimenting, it's helpful to run them all. So this is a reminder to open up the adjustments folder in the layers palette to see the different effects. So when you open that up, there are 10 different layers here created by the actions. There's one for shadow recovery, highlight recovery, adding haze, washed out, faded, lighten, darken, brighten. There's a contrast boost and a contrast reduction. And you can use as many or as few of these as you like. If you'd like to use several, you can just select them all and it will kind of create a stacked effect. And you can also adjust them as needed. For example, I'm going to use a darken with this photo, but that's a stronger effect than I would like, so I'm going to select the layer and then go up to the opacity. By default it's set at 50%. I'm going to reduce that to 25% to get a little bit of a softer effect here. Okay. And you can also do the same thing by adjusting the opacity with the other effects. For example, here's the haze. You could select that and increase it to add more haze, decrease it to add less haze. So for this photo, I'm going to do the highlight recovery and the darken. And then I'll close that folder, move on to the tones. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to click the Run All action, and it will apply them all in the Layers palette, and then I can choose what I want to use. There's your reminder to open the Tones folder. So again, all these are also customizable by adjusting the opacity. So for example, we have Vibrant is the first one, set to 50% opacity by default. If you want it even more vibrant and more saturated, you can increase the opacity. If you want to use it but you want it to be a softer effect, you can just reduce the opacity. So there's Vibrant, and we have the warming, cooling, desaturate, which with the desaturated, if you increase the opacity all the way, it will eventually become completely desaturated, black and white. Then there are several different colors here. There's some solid colors. And all of these you can increase the strength or decrease it by adjusting the opacity in the same way. And then there's two vintage tones down here. Again, increase the opacity for a stronger effect, decrease it for a softer effect. And for this photo, I think I'm going to work with the vintage tones number 2, and I'm going to decrease that opacity a little bit. It starts at 25%. I'm going to try 15% to make it a little bit softer. Okay, now I'll close that folder. We can move on to the light leaks. There's again a run all action for the light leaks if you just want to see how each one will impact the photo. There are several different colors of light leaks. Here's your reminder to open the light leaks folder. And each color has 3 different variations. So there's one on the left, one on the right, and one on the top. And then there's orange, red, violet, orange to blue, red to violet, and green to gold. You can also adjust the opacity. In most cases, you're going to want to reduce the effect on this with a lot of photos. So if you select the layer and go to the opacity, this one by default is at 70%. If you reduce it down to say 45% or 50%, somewhere in there, it'll give you, still have the light leak effect, but it will be a softer effect. And of course, if you want to increase the opacity, that will make it a stronger effect. So I'm going to not use any of the light leaks on this photo. And if you go on, there are 2 actions for adding grain. There's a light grain and a heavy grain, and both of them are customizable as well. Here I added the heavy grain. It is a pretty heavy effect, although it will depend a little bit on the photo that you're working with. If the photo has a lot of grain or noise in it to start with, it will be a stronger effect. If you want to customize the effect further, you can double click where it says add noise. It uses smart objects, so you can then customize the exact amount of grain. So the heavy grain by default is at 20%. If you wanted a softer effect, you could reduce it down to say 10%. That will give you the specific amount of grain that you want. Then there are 3 actions for adding vignettes. There is a soft vignette, medium, and a heavy. With this photo, I'm not going to use any of those. Then there are the finishes. There's one for making snapshots. If you're not familiar with Photoshop's snapshots functionality, it can be pretty helpful for recording your history. So for example, I'm going to record a snapshot now. And this message tells you your snapshot has been recorded. When you want to access it, you go to the histories window. Okay, so it doesn't really look like it made any changes at this point. You still have all the layers here in the layers palette, but I'll show what it did in just a minute here. So then when you're done with your image and you want to save it or print it, you can run the flattening action. And this is a reminder to run the make new snapshot action before you flatten it, which I already did. So I'm going to go ahead and flatten, and now you can see it's all been condensed into the one layer in the layers palette. So now at this point, if you flattened it and you decide you want to make a change and you need to get the layers back, you can go to Window, History, and as long as you've made a snapshot, it will be up here. You can click on the snapshot, and now you can see all the layers are back just like it was at the time the snapshot was made. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the flattened version and move on with the final actions in the set. Here we have a light sharpening and a stronger sharpening. So when you click it, it just reminds you to flatten it. If you've already flattened it, you can go ahead and run that, and it'll sharpen the photo a little bit. And so that shows how you can use those actions with the run all actions. You don't have to run them all. If you wanted to, well, let's see, for example, I'm going to go back to the history, and we'll go back to the original photo. Okay, so here's our starting photo. If I wanted to get basically the same effect without running all of the actions, I'd start with the base. I used washed vintage, so I would just select that action and run it. Then from there, move on to the tones. So I did highlight recovery, and I darkened it. So run that one, and then I decreased the opacity there. And move on to the tones. I used vintage tones too. So select that, play it, and I decreased the opacity on that one as well. I think I did 15%. I didn't do any of the light leaks. I did the heavy grain and changed that to 10%. So there I had the same effect with just a few clicks without running all the actions. So you can do it either way. It's just that the run all actions are helpful if you're experimenting and not sure which ones will work best with your photo. These actions also work with Photoshop elements. So I'm going to flip over there and quickly demonstrate how they work there. It's pretty much the same. The base actions have a run all action. So this will do basically the same thing that it did in the Photoshop version. It will apply all 20 of the bases, each one in a separate folder, and then you can show or hide them to find which one you like best for your photo. So this is running here, it'll be done in just a second. Okay, now it's done. You can see all of the base effects over here. When it's run, none of the effects will be active, so we'll just click on the icon to show the effects. So in this case I used washed vintage, so we'll show that one. And you can just do the same thing, show and hide, to get whichever one you want. With Photoshop Elements, working with folders is a little bit different than Photoshop. It doesn't support folders in the same way. So if you want to open the folder to access the individual layers or adjustment layers, you'll need to select the folder in the layers palette, then come over here to the finishes, to this open folder action, and play that. And it will remind you to select the folder that you want, which I already did, and then it opens it, and you can see all the individual layers here. So then you could make changes to any of the individual layers as needed. You could also hide them if you wanted to. Let's see some of the other differences in the Elements version. The adjustments, tones, and light leaks do not have a run all action because of the way that Photoshop Elements deals with folders. It's just a little bit easier to run them individually rather than putting them all in a folder, then having to run another action to open the folder and working like that. So we haven't included the run all actions for those, but you would use it basically the same way that you would in Photoshop. You would just run one at a time. So in this case I would click highlight recovery, run that, darken, run the darken action, reduce the opacity, and so on. So you would just run the one specifically that you want. And the last difference is in the grains. Photoshop Elements does not support smart objects, so you can't edit the amount of grain the same way that you can in Photoshop. What you can do is reduce the opacity. So in this case I ran the heavy grain. I want to reduce it down to 50% to get a softer effect, and you can reduce it to whatever amount you want. And then also Photoshop Elements does not support snapshots functionality like Photoshop does, so there is no action for making a snapshot. That basically shows how you can use these vintage actions to get a customized vintage effect that will work great with your photos. Thank you for watching.